Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder. And last time, Hardee followed his state of Georgia out of the Union, was sent to Arkansas, then Kentucky, where he and the Confederate Army in the West retreated into Tennessee and Mississippi. Now we join Hardee just before the Battle of Shiloh. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. From their camps around Corinth, the newly christened Army of the Mississippi, of which William Hardee was a part, was just 20 miles from the enemy around Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. The army was divided into 3 corps and a reserve. Hardee was named one of the corps commanders, along with Leonidas Polk and Braxton Bragg. John C. Breckinridge, the former Vice President of the United States, commanded the reserve. Hardee's was one of the smaller corps, but they had fought as a unit for longer, so when Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard drew up the marching orders to proceed to Pittsburgh Landing, Hardee's corps would be in the front, and they would also be in the front when the attack commenced. Hardee and the rest of the army moved out on April 3rd. Hardee's men approached the Union position on April 5th and halted to allow the rest of the army to come up and get into position. That evening, Hardee, Albert Sidney Johnston, the army commander, and the rest of the corps commanders gathered at the commanding general's headquarters. They sipped coffee and ate thin crackers, with Johnston listening to his subordinates. Some of them mentioned not making an attack at all, but when rifle fire was heard in the distance, Johnston said, "Gentlemen, the ball is opened. No time for argument now." One soldier remembered, "How well do I remember General Hardee as he quitted the group and made for his horse. His form was erect, his stride long but regular, and as he walked he gathered up his trailing sword that had hung loosely by his side, and tucking it in under his left arm, so reached his horse, and at a gallop went in the direction of his command." When the attacks commenced, Hardee rode along his entire battle line, attempting to keep his men moving. When he went to the right, he found Johnston. They met in the newly captured Union camp. Both Johnston and Hardee advanced ahead of their battle line to reconnoiter the next Union defensive position, and came under artillery fire, which forced them to pull back. Then Hardee heard heavy artillery fire and rifle fire coming from his left. Johnston remained on the right, and Hardee went to the left, where Patrick Cleburne's brigade was having a difficult time. A swampy area divided the brigade and reduced its firepower. Hardee attempted to get it back in line, and only when some other Confederate troops outflanked the Union soldiers, giving Cleburne so much trouble, did the Federals withdraw. A Union holdout, now known as the Hornet's Nest, prevented a lot of the rebel brigades from advancing. Johnston assigned Hardee to help remove those Federals from the Hornet's Nest. Meanwhile, Johnston was killed, placing Beauregard as commander of the army. One of Beauregard's staffers recalled Hardee during April 6th. "I found his command chagrin the enemy, the general with his men cheering them on. Nothing could exceed his coolness and gallantry. He was always in the thickest of the fight. His answer to my question if he wished anything was, 'Tell the general we are getting along very well, but they are putting it to us very severely.' Not once did he ask for assistance." An artillery battery was captured by Union forces with some infantry too intimidated to move forward. Hardee inspired the Missourians with his presence, ordering them to stand up. Then Hardee called to the Louisiana Crescent Regiment and directed both regiments to recapture the guns. General Hardee took his place in front of the regiment, ordered the charge, and led it in person. He was the bravest man I ever saw in my 4 years' experience in the war. We followed him with a yell at the charge of bayonets, and drove back the enemy from the guns and restored them to the grateful Louisianians. Beauregard halted further attacks when the Confederate Army pushed Ulysses S. Grant's men to Pittsburgh Landing, hoping to finish the job the next day. Hardee passed the night on the right of the Confederate line. During the night, Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest of the cavalry came to Hardee and reported enemy reinforcements coming across the river. Hardee told Forrest to report it to Beauregard. Forrest returned at 2 a.m. He hadn't found Beauregard, though. Hardee told him to return to his regiment and keep vigilant. The next day, Hardee commanded the troops on the right of the line, but the new reinforcements from Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio pushed the Confederates back, eventually forcing Beauregard to order a general withdrawal. The battle wreaked havoc on the Army of the Mississippi. Hardee's corps was hit especially hard. Hardee reported, "We gained a great victory at a great sacrifice of life, but owing to the arrival of Buell, it has not been so productive of results as might have been desired. Our loss has been heavy. I don't think we can yet regard ourselves as soldiers. Our men are not sufficiently impressed with a sense of honor, that it is better to die by far than to run. We fail also in company officers. They want skill and instruction and lamentably neglected their duty. In another letter, he wrote, I had my beautiful black shot in the shoulder, and 2 balls passed through my coat. One wounded me slightly in the arm. Providence has mysteriously preserved me for another time or a different fate. An impactful soldier came into Hardee's life as the Confederate Army settled back into Corinth, following the defeat at Shiloh. His name was Thomas Benton Roy, a Virginian on Beauregard's staff, who was appointed to Hardee's staff as his assistant adjutant general, and soon would become his chief of staff. Roy heard rumors of the strict disciplinarian and feared working for him. He wrote, I had never seen him before, and his presence and bearing and the very sound of his voice seemed to me expression of a dynamic power that could, if it were, lift a man out of his boots or take the roof off of a house. But Roy found that Hardee received and treated me with the utmost kindness. The Union Army lurched forward from Pittsburg Landing in pursuit of the Confederates at Corinth. A few attacks were made against the Union Army, but nothing significant. On the night of May 29th, the Confederate Army evacuated Corinth and withdrew to Tupelo, Mississippi. While there, Beauregard was removed as commander of the army, and Braxton Bragg was put in his place. When Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio began to threaten Chattanooga, one of the most important railroad hubs in the South, Bragg ordered Hardee to move the Army of the Mississippi to Chattanooga, while he went to meet with the commander of East Tennessee, Edmund Kirby Smith, leaving Van Dorn's army in Mississippi. Hardee moved the troops by rail to Mobile, then by steamer to Montgomery, where they got on railroad cars again destined for Chattanooga. When the army arrived, Bragg took back control of the army. Bragg reorganized his command into 2 wings, one under Hardee and one under Leonidas Polk. Bragg decided after consultation with Smith that they would invade Kentucky. The 2 wings, the Army of the Mississippi and the Army of East Tennessee, entered the Bluegrass State at different locations with the intention of linking up and combating the Union Army of the Ohio in Kentucky. In Kentucky, Bragg installed a Confederate governor in Frankfort. When the Union Army caught up to Bragg, the Confederate forces were spread out. Once concentrated, Bragg's army pounced on the extended Union column that approached them outside the town of Perryville. As one of Hardee's biographers explains, Hardee's role at Perryville was equal to, if not better than, his performance at Shiloh. He spotted the gap in the center of the Union line and threw Patrick Cleburne into it, breaking Alexander McCook's right and containing Philip Sheridan. Hardee is responsible for placing the Confederates in their positions the night before the battle and for designing the plan of action for Joseph Wheeler and St. John Liddell. The temporary stand by these 2 brigades enticed forward the advance elements of McCook's corps and ensured that the main line could be formed leisurely. Despite Hardee's performance at Perryville, it was a strategic defeat for the Confederacy, even though it was a tactical victory. The Confederate Army began to withdraw, and at a council of war it was decided that they would leave Kentucky. St. John Liddell couldn't believe the news and came to Hardee to voice his displeasure at leaving the state. Hardee responded jokingly, "You speak very plainly. I am half inclined to arrest you." Hardee didn't like the decision either. He and others started to turn against Bragg as army commander. Hardee wrote to President Jefferson Davis's aide about Bragg that, at Perryville, he reversed the military rule of attacking fractions of the enemy with the mass of his forces and deliberately attacked Buell's army with a fraction of his own. To relieve Bragg is easy enough. To provide a competent successor is a more difficult matter. Bragg has proved a failure, it is true, but have we anybody who will do better? I confess this has been a strong reason in restraining me from speaking out boldly in reference to the failure in Kentucky. The Army moved into southeastern Kentucky through the Cumberland Gap, then to Morristown, Tennessee, and Knoxville. The troops in Hardee traveled by rail to Chattanooga, then by rail again as far as Estill Springs. Then they began to march to Shelbyville, Tennessee. Bragg reorganized the army into 2 corps, split again between Hardee and Polk, and christened the Army of Tennessee. During the reorganization, Simon Bolivar Buckner was removed from division command to be sent to Mobile to organize its defenses. This left a division command open. Hardee fought hard to get Cleburne the promotion to Major General and the command of a division. Davis came to the army in December 1862 and brought Cleburne's commission with him. In Wartrace and Murfreesboro, Hardee enjoyed the company of the ladies of both locations. They frequented his headquarters and he visited their homes. He wasn't alone either. John Hunt Morgan, the flamboyant cavalry raider, was with them on multiple occasions, visiting the Ready household to see Maddie Ready. The courtship resulted in a wedding that winter with Hardee and the other generals in attendance. Morgan gave Hardee a beautiful thoroughbred to show his appreciation to the general. Hardee had been incredibly influential in Morgan becoming a brigadier general. Willie Hardee, the general's son, visited his father at Murfreesboro for Christmas that year. At the end of December, the Union Army of the Cumberland, now commanded by William S. Rosecrans, moved out of Nashville and toward the Army of Tennessee near Murfreesboro. Bragg positioned his army to go on the offensive and attack on December 31st in the early morning. Hardee's divisions were split, being on the extreme right and part being on the extreme left. The Confederates attacked in two lines that morning, which was designed to keep the momentum going once the assault commenced. However, one of Hardee's lead divisions under John P. McCown, instead of swinging to the right, swung to the left, creating a hole in the Confederate line. Hardee moved Claiborne from the second line into the gap and continued the push. The whole day saw Hardee traversing the battlefield, attempting to coordinate his divisions in their drive against the Federals. For the most part, it was working, except for a holdout known as the Slaughter Pen. The Union soldiers were retreating toward the Nashville Pike, but try as he might, Hardee couldn't dislodge the Federals from their new defensive position. The fight ended on December 31st with heavy casualties, but not a lot to show for it. On January 1st, the two sides skirmished with one another, but no major attacks were made. On January 2nd, Hardee was riding along his lines when he heard an attack taking place on his right, where he had placed one of his divisions, the one under John C. Breckinridge. Without his knowledge, Bragg had ordered Breckinridge to make an attack, which ended in a brutal disaster for the rebel division. As one of Hardee's biographers describes, the attack on December 31st represents probably Hardee's best effort as a battle leader. His opening attack had been savage and its weight far out of proportion to its numbers. He drove superior forces back and engaged at one time or another during that drive 4 enemy divisions and parts of 2 others. After the defeat, Bragg called his subordinates together and asked their opinions. They all agreed, with more Union reinforcements coming and the Army of the Cumberland already being larger than they were, that the best option would be to retreat. They did so, moving southeast to Tullahoma. There it came to Bragg's attention that a newspaper declared the defeat Bragg's fault, that he had lost the confidence of his generals, and that the retreat went against the advice of his corps commanders. Bragg asked if his subordinates would write a statement that they agreed to the retreat as well, saying that he would happily retire if he had lost the confidence of his men. Polk and Division Commander Benjamin Cheatham gave Bragg the answer he wanted. Hardee stunned Bragg. He wrote, "I feel that frankness compels me to say that the general officers whose judgment you have invoked are unanimous in the opinion that a change in command of this army is necessary. In this opinion I concur." Breckinridge and Claiborne both agreed with Hardee's statement. Bragg was taken aback. To a friend, Bragg wrote about Hardee that he is a good drill master, but no more, except that he is gallant. He has no ability to organize and supply an army, and no confidence in himself when approached by an enemy. These assertions are false, as Bragg repeatedly put responsibilities on Hardee. He wouldn't have had he truly thought what he wrote to his friend. The departmental commander, Joseph E. Johnston, was dispatched by President Davis to the Army of Tennessee to fill out the situation. Johnston found that the Army commander had lost the confidence of his corps commanders, but didn't recommend him to be relieved. Later, Bragg began to accuse Polk of disobedience during the Kentucky campaign, and accused Hardee of supporting Polk in the disobedience. Hardee ignored the accusation, but he did write privately to Polk that, if you choose to rip up the Kentucky campaign, you can tear Bragg to pieces. During the spring of 1863, Hardee sought to build a corps of soldiers that were unparalleled on the drill field, so that they would be confident in battle. He drilled them every day, and sometimes personally drilled them, but he always reviewed them. In that way, he personally inspected each and every soldier of his corps. His reviews became an institution, and delighted Southern ladies came frequently from as far as northern Alabama to attend them. Eager young officers rode off into the countryside and brought back loads of guests. At one April review, for instance, 500 women turned out to cheer them in. Hardee did not intend for the women to be mere window dressing. In the middle of the review, he would call forward men in his command who had behaved meritoriously, introduce them to the ladies, and have an account of their services read aloud. After reviews, Hardee would have entertainment provided for his visitors, tournaments, horse races, banquets, parties, dances, and serenades. It wasn't just ladies who attended the reviews. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Freemantle of the British Coldstream Guards was in attendance for at least one review. He wrote, "They drilled tolerably well, and an advance in line was remarkably good, but General Liddell had invented several dodges of his own, for which he was reproved by General Hardee. The soldiers afterwards wanted General Hardee to say something, but he declined. I imagine that the discipline in this army is the strictest in the Confederacy, and that the men are much better marchers than those I saw in Mississippi." Hardee faced a new enemy during his time in Confederate service. Publishers of his Manual of Arms he originally published in 1855. He had a publisher in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who would give him royalties on its sales, but the war cut him off from that publisher. However, that publisher failed to copyright the work. So publishers both North and South began to print the book, and they sold by the thousands, without Hardee seeing any royalties from the sales. He took some publishers to court, but the suit failed. Then a petition was submitted to the Confederate House of Representatives and the Committee on Patents. The petition was to create a special copyright for the manual. That was also turned down. However, Congress added an amendment to the bill, creating a copyright for Hardee that would allow the bill to pass. Since an outright copyright would prevent publishers who had already printed books from making money off its sales, the amendment stated that the law was not retroactive, that they were free to sell what they had printed, but couldn't print any more. It's not known how much in royalties Hardee received, and it's doubtful that the amount was substantial because the heaviest publications came in the first year of the war.